After World War II, the world did not enter peace. It entered a new kind of war. A war without official declarations, without clear battlefields, without uniforms on the front lines. On one side stood the United States, on the other, the Soviet Union. Two superpowers, two ideologies, two visions of the future. Capitalism versus communism, democracy versus state control. But this conflict would not be fought only with tanks or soldiers. It would be fought in the shadows. In 1947, the United States created a new institution designed to operate beyond public view, the CIA. Its mission was clear: gather intelligence, prevent communist expansion, and protect American interests abroad. But the methods? Those would rarely be discussed openly. Across the world, alliances shifted. Nations were pressured to choose sides. Fear became a political tool. Suspicion became normal. This was not just a geopolitical struggle. It was a psychological warfare. And from the very beginning, secrecy was its most powerful weapon. The Cold War had begun, and most of the battles would never appear on a map. As the Cold War intensified, open confrontation between superpowers became too dangerous, so the battlefield shifted into secrecy. The CIA was no longer just gathering information, it was shaping events. Governments were monitored, political movements were infiltrated, elections were influenced from behind the curtain. The goal was simple: stop the spread of communism at any cost. In Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union expanded its sphere of influence. In response, Washington began funding opposition groups, supporting resistance movements, and building intelligence networks deep inside hostile territories. But these operations were rarely clean. Covert missions required plausible deniability. If something went wrong, there could be no official connection, no fingerprints, no acknowledgement. Money flowed quietly into foreign campaigns. Propaganda was distributed through front organizations. Alliances were formed with questionable figures, as long as they served the objective. The Cold War was no longer just a standoff between armies. It was a silent contest of manipulation, influence, and control. And the deeper it went, the harder it became to distinguish defense from intervention, or protection from interference.
By the early 1950s, fear had reached a new level. What if the enemy could control the human mind? What if prisoners of war were being reprogrammed? What if communism wasn't just an ideology, but a psychological weapon? Inside the CIA, a classified project began. It was called MK Ultra. Its objective was simple and terrifying: develop techniques for mind control, interrogation, and psychological manipulation. The methods? Secret drug experiments, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, LSD administered without consent. Many of the subjects had no idea they were part of an experiment. Some were prisoners, some were psychiatric patients, some were ordinary citizens. The program operated through universities, hospitals, and research institutions, often without the knowledge of those involved. Documents would later reveal that ethical boundaries were not just crossed, they were erased. When MK Ultra was exposed in the 1970s, much of the evidence had already been destroyed. But enough survived to confirm one thing. In the name of national security, lines that once seemed unthinkable had been crossed. The Cold War was not only a struggle between nations, it was a struggle over the limits of power itself. And in that struggle, morality often became collateral damage. By the early 1961, tension in the Western Hemisphere had reached a boiling point. Just 90 miles from Florida, a revolution had succeeded. Fidel Castro had taken control of Cuba and openly aligned himself with the Soviet Union. For Washington, this was unacceptable. A communist government in the Americas was seen not just as a political shift, but as a direct threat. Behind closed doors, the CIA began planning a covert invasion. The idea was to train Cuban exiles, arm them, and send them back to spark an internal uprising against Castro. It had to look organic, spontaneous, plausibly deniable. In April 1961, approximately 1,400 CIA-trained exiles landed at a remote beach known as the Bay of Pigs. They expected air support. They expected local resistance against Castro. They expected momentum. They got none of it. Cuban forces responded quickly and decisively. Within 72 hours, the invasion collapsed. Over 100 were killed. More than 1,000 were captured. The newly elected president, John F. Kennedy, publicly took responsibility for the failure. The humiliation was global. For Castro, it was validation. For the Soviet Union, it was opportunity. And for the United States, it was a lesson. Covert power does not guarantee control. Sometimes secrecy magnifies failure. And this failure would push the world even closer to catastrophe.
The failure at the Bay of Pigs did not end the confrontation. It escalated it. In October 1962, American reconnaissance flights captured images that would change everything. Soviet nuclear missile sites were being constructed in Cuba. Operational launch facilities capable of striking major U.S. cities within minutes. The Soviet Union, under Nikita Khrushchev, had made its move. When the photographs reached President John F. Kennedy, the United States faced an impossible decision: do nothing and appear weak, strike and risk nuclear war. Instead, Kennedy announced a naval quarantine around Cuba. American warships moved into position. Nuclear forces were placed on high alert. For 13 days, the world stood on the edge. Behind the scenes, military commanders urged decisive action. Some argued for airstrikes, others for invasion. Every hour increased the risk of miscalculation. Soviet ships steamed toward the blockade line. American submarines tracked Soviet vessels beneath the Atlantic. One wrong signal, one nervous commander, one misunderstood order, and the Cold War could have become the final war. But diplomacy, fragile and secretive, prevailed. In exchange for the removal of Soviet missiles from Cuba, the United States quietly agreed to remove its own missiles from Turkey. No victory parades, no dramatic speeches, just a silent step back from the abyss. The world exhaled. But something fundamental had changed. Both sides now understood how close they had come to annihilation, and fear became institutionalized. Not every weapon in the Cold War exploded. Some whispered. While missiles stood ready in silos, another battlefield stretched across newspapers, radio waves, cinema screens, and classrooms. It was a war for perception. The CIA understood that influence could be more powerful than force. Winning allies meant shaping narratives.
Controlling fear meant controlling information. Cultural programs were funded. Intellectual movements were quietly supported. Media outlets, sometimes knowingly, sometimes not, became channels of strategic messaging. On the other side, the Soviet Union deployed its own propaganda machine, portraying the United States as imperialist, corrupt, and morally decaying. Each side claimed to defend freedom. Each side accused the other of tyranny. Psychological operations, or psyops, aimed to weaken morale, destabilize governments, and create doubt within enemy populations. Radio broadcasts crossed borders. Pamphlets were dropped from the sky. Rumors were planted carefully, designed to grow on their own. Truth became flexible. Facts became tools, and citizens, often unaware, became participants in a global psychological experiment. The Cold War was not just about territory. It was about belief. And belief, once manipulated, could reshape entire nations. While public speeches spoke of freedom and democracy, quiet interventions were unfolding across the globe. The Cold War was not confined to Washington and Moscow. It extended into Latin America, the Middle East, Africa, and Southeast Asia. In 1953, Iran became a turning point. Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh moved to nationalize the country's oil industry, challenging Western economic interests. Soon after, a covert operation supported by the CIA helped orchestrate his removal. Officially, it was framed as internal unrest. Unofficially, it reshaped the region for decades. 1 year later, in Guatemala, President Jacobo Arbenz pursued land reforms that threatened powerful corporate interests. A coordinated campaign of psychological warfare, economic pressure, and paramilitary support destabilized his government. He resigned. These operations followed a pattern. Identify a leader seen as hostile to U.S. interests, fund opposition, spread destabilizing narratives, create internal pressure, then step back publicly. The justification was containment, prevent the spread of communism, maintain global balance. But the consequences were rarely contained. Authoritarian regimes rose, civil conflicts deepened, and resentment toward foreign interference grew. The Cold War was not only a standoff between superpowers. For many nations, it was an era of disruption, shaped by decisions made far beyond their borders. The United States and the Soviet Union rarely fought each other directly. The risk was too great. Instead, they fought through others. Regional conflicts became arenas where superpowers tested strength without officially declaring war. In Southeast Asia, the Vietnam War became one of the most visible examples. The United States intervened to prevent the expansion of communism, while North Vietnam received support from the Soviet Union and China. What began as a regional struggle evolved into a prolonged and devastating conflict. Tens of thousands of American soldiers died. Millions of Vietnamese civilians and combatants lost their lives. Yet Washington and Moscow never declared war on each other. The pattern repeated elsewhere. In Afghanistan during the 1980s, the Soviet Union invaded to maintain influence. In response, the United States supplied weapons and funding to Afghan resistance fighters. The battlefield was local. The strategy was global. Africa and Latin America saw similar dynamics. Civil wars fueled by external funding, weapons shipments, and ideological pressure. These were called proxy wars, indirect confrontations. But for the people living through them, the violence was anything but indirect. Cities were destroyed,
Generations were traumatized, and the superpowers calculated risks from a distance. The Cold War avoided a direct nuclear clash, but it extracted its cost in other nations' blood. The failure at the Bay of Pigs did not end the confrontation. It escalated it. In October 1962, American reconnaissance flights captured images that would change everything. Soviet nuclear missile sites were being constructed in Cuba. Operational launch facilities, capable of striking major U.S. cities within minutes. The Soviet Union, under Nikita Khrushchev, had made its move. When the photographs reached President John F. Kennedy, the United States faced an impossible decision: do nothing and appear weak, strike and risk nuclear war. Instead, Kennedy announced a naval quarantine around Cuba. American warships moved into position. Nuclear forces were placed on high alert. For 13 days, the world stood on the edge. Behind the scenes, military commanders urged decisive action. Some argued for airstrikes, others for invasion. Every hour increased the risk of miscalculation. Soviet ships steamed toward the blockade line. American submarines tracked Soviet vessels beneath the Atlantic. One wrong signal, one nervous commander, one misunderstood order, and the Cold War could have become the final war. But diplomacy, fragile and secretive, prevailed. In exchange for the removal of Soviet missiles from Cuba, the United States quietly agreed to remove its own missiles from Turkey. No victory parades, no dramatic speeches, just a silent step back from the abyss. The world exhaled. But something fundamental had changed. Both sides now understood how close they had come to annihilation, and fear became institutionalized. Not every weapon in the Cold War exploded. Some whispered. While missiles stood ready in silos, another battlefield stretched across newspapers, radio waves, cinema screens, and classrooms. It was a war for perception. The CIA understood that influence could be more powerful than force. Winning allies meant shaping narratives. Controlling fear meant controlling information. Cultural programs were funded. Intellectual movements were quietly supported. Media outlets, sometimes knowingly, sometimes not, became channels of strategic messaging. On the other side, the Soviet Union deployed its own propaganda machine, portraying the United States as imperialist, corrupt, and morally decaying. Each side claimed to defend freedom. Each side accused the other of tyranny. Psychological operations, or psyops, aimed to weaken morale, destabilize governments, and create doubt within enemy populations. Radio broadcasts crossed borders. Pamphlets were dropped from the sky. Rumors were planted carefully, designed to grow on their own. Truth became flexible. Facts became tools, and citizens, often unaware, became participants in a global psychological experiment. The Cold War was not just about territory. It was about belief. And belief, once manipulated, could reshape entire nations.